What's about the predecisional hypothesis propagandized by the BBC documentary The Conspiracy Files?
Through here, the red area is showing where we had observed structural damage. You see there's a little bit of...
They say the main reason for the collapse were normal office fires, not the diesel as first thought.
You can see here we either have large sagging or buckling occurring in some of these floor beams, and these circles indicate the condition of the connections, where yellow is a partial failure and a pink is a full failure where the entire connection no longer is attached to the column.
Our working hypothesis now actually suggests that it was normal building fires that were growing and spreading throughout the multiple floors that may have caused the ultimate collapse of the buildings.
Investigators have focused on the east side, where the long floor spans were under most stress. They think fires burnt long enough to weaken and break many of the connections that held the steel structure together. Most susceptible were the thinner floor beams, which required less fireproofing, and the connections between the beams and the columns. As they heated up, the connections failed, and the beams sagged and failed also.
The combination of those two effects makes that column go unstable. When that happens, it leads then to a very large unsupported column length. It turns out that when you have connections that essentially don't have strength for the loads that they are being subjected to, and you have this massive failure of a column, it does not take time. The structure has lost all integrity at that point in time.
Indeed, the working hypothesis sounds very familiar. In fact, it is a reissue of the FEMA hypothesis of the failing truss connections called pancaking theory. Once FEMA brought it to light, anyone who criticized the pancaking theory had to be a conspiracy nut. Later NIST ceased to support the pancaking theory because they found no evidence at all. Fireproofing or no fireproofing, the truss connection didn't fail.
In 2002, NOVA depicted a scenario envisioned by many experts at the time, that the truss connections failed in the extreme heat, causing the floors to fall onto one another, precipitating the collapse.
Investigators have focused on the east side, where the long floor spans were under most stress. They think fires burnt long enough to weaken and break many of the connections that held the steel structure together. Most susceptible were the thinner floor beams, which required less fireproofing, and the connections between the beams and the columns. As they heated up, the connections failed, and the beams sagged and failed also.
The collapse.
When you did it previously, you showed that the floors actually pancaked. And we did not see any evidence of pancaking in the videos or photographs we have.
By creating computer-enhanced images of the exterior walls, NIST discovered that the truss connections did not fail. In fact, the trusses stayed connected to the columns even as they sagged from the heat.
The connections failed, and the beams sagged and failed also.
The combination of those two effects makes that column go unstable. It was the combination of the impact, the fireproofing that was dislodged, and the jet fuel fires that caused the buildings to collapse. These buildings were sound, well-designed, highly innovative, and there was nothing that could have changed the outcome on 9/11. When that happens, it leads then to a very large unsupported column length.
Fireproofing or no fireproofing, this time the connections of heavy steel beams need to fail on at least 5 floors, one above the other. This picture shows an unsupported length of 3 floors. Where did the floors go? Is there any evidence for any floor collapse or hanging floor slap in the photos and videos? According to the NIST interim report, column 79, which had a service load stress of approximately 21 ksi, would be approaching its load carrying capacity for an unsupported length of 4 stories, if it was also subject to a uniform temperature of 500 degrees Celsius. And according to the long-lasting inferno of the McGrattan simulation, no column reached a uniform temperature above 150 degrees Celsius, and there wasn't more than 3 floors on fire, one above the other. So either we have to believe in pancaking without evidence, or the unsupported length cannot exceed 3 floors. Should we believe that no column approached its load-carrying capacity? One may guess that NIST will find a way to square the circle. However, 5 days after the collapse, an airborne visible infrared imaging spectrometer of the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory took a snapshot at ground zero. The AVIRIS indicated a hotspot of still 727 degrees Celsius right below column 81. The temperature scale of the McGrattan simulation don't exceed 675 degrees Celsius. Some simulated steel beams of the lateral bracing reached the upper limit of the temperature, but 30 minutes later the color of the same steel beams indicates a temperature of about 450 degrees. Nevertheless, this time NIST has an example of a floor collapse simply due to a normal office fire.
And there's hard physical evidence from another building at the World Trade Center, which helps explain how fire could have caused Tower 7 to collapse.
Several of us went into Building 5, and as we walked along on the floor, we came to the edge of a concrete slab and looked out and were stunned because we saw a major collapse. We saw an interior section of the building that had collapsed simply due to fire.
The structure has lost all integrity at that point in time.
But NIST and the documentary forgot to mention something. The color red indicates the area of the collapse due to fire. According to the FEMA report, the 8th floor collapsed onto the 7th floor, and then both onto the 6th, and so on, down to the 4th floor. There was significant fire damage on floors 4 through 8. On some floors, the interior had been completely gutted by fire. Furthermore, we learn that the columns had the characteristics of a 3-hour fire resistance rating, and the floor-to-floor beams had the characteristics of a 2-hour fire resistance rating. Let's say the horizontal floor beams resisted for 2 hours and collapsed a short time later. The combustible material around the column trees fell away, and the columns survived without buckling and without fireproofing. Seemingly the fire around the columns lasted a little longer than a 3-hour fire resistance rating would allow. By the way, the columns and the floor beams of WTC7 had the same resistance ratings. Meanwhile, in WTC5 neither floor 9 collapsed due to the upper layer temperature on the 8th floor, nor the 4th floor collapsed due to fire, while carrying the loads of 4 collapsed floors. So why did 5, 6, 7, 8 collapse, and why did they fell onto floor 4 without enough kinetic energy to pancake it all the way down to the lowest basement level? Firstly, there was no fire on the 3rd floor. Secondly, the interior bay framing on the floors 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 was different. According to the FEMA report, the local collapse due to fire appeared to have begun at the field connection, where beams were connected to the shop-fabricated beam stubs and column assemblies. The end-bearing resistance of the beam web was found to be less than the double shear strength of the high-strength bolts. And at 550 degrees Celsius the ultimate resistance of the 3 bolts decreased for about 50% of the capacity at room temperature. So what do we learn from the conspiracy files example? We learn that any other connection didn't fail in that uncontrolled inferno. The 9th floor sagged due to the upper layer temperature of the 5 burning floors below, but the connections of the 9th floor didn't fail. Even the shop-fabricated beam stubs of the collapsed floors didn't fail. And finally, the bolted connections of the 4th floor stopped the fall of 4 floors simply because these fragile connections were not exposed to heat and fire from below. One or more column on the 8th floor buckled due to fire. According to the FEMA report, the fireproofing fell off when the columns started to buckle. But the fireproofing of straight parts of the beam is missing also. Possibly the fireproofing was partially fallen off due to falling debris that smashed through the roof and hit the floor above. Seemingly fluid roof tar dripped down next to this column. Right. For the first time the documentary has shown the same buckled column from a slightly different perspective and daylight flooding through a hole in the 9th floor. But the FEMA reported no collapse on the 9th floor due to fire. In other words, something very heavy crashed on top of this column and crushed the concrete of the roof and the 9th floor. However, this column didn't buckle as fast as free fall. 6 days later, the rubble of WTC5 was as cold as the West Broadway. As far as is known, WTC7 had neither shop-fabricated column assemblies nor bolted floor beams attached to it. WTC7 had no fire on more than 3 floors one above the other, and besides the simulation, these fires spread relatively quickly and apparently died down after about 30 minutes in the same area. 12 days later, a small spot in the rubble was still too hot to fry a pancake on it. And suddenly the rubble disappeared.